Mark decided it was time to finally start his DIY project in the garden. After digging for a few days, Mark felt a hard object touching the end of his shovel. He started digging more and unearthed a giant object, but at first he was unsure what it was. Mark decided to sleep on it overnight, but in the middle of the night, Mark woke up with a start and suddenly realized what it really was, and he called the police immediately to explain that he needed their help ASAP. When the police arrived at the house, they still had no idea what they would be dealing with. Mark had not been entirely honest with them yet, as he wanted their confirmation first. However, the moment the officer laid eyes on it, Mark knew he had been correct. The police told Mark he shouldn't have seen this, and he couldn't agree more. Within minutes, there were at least 20 other officers on the scene taking care of the mat. Mark was quickly transported to the police station. He was going to have a lot of explaining to do. But what did Mark find on his property? Why did the police get involved, and why was Mark not supposed to see this thing? But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Mark's wife, Patricia, had been on his ass about finally getting a pool in the garden for nearly 5 years by now. It was a promise that he had made when they bought the house, but one that he had not yet delivered. They were not going on vacation this summer, and thus he had a lot of free time this year. The first step in making the pool was to dig a hole in the garden. Mark decided to take this task upon himself with the help of his 2 sons, Toby and Brian. On the second day of digging, Mark had nearly reached the desired depth for the hole. However, his heart sank when his shovel struck something unusual. It didn't sound like wood. Instead, it was distinctly metal, a discovery that seemed impossible. He had chosen this particular spot precisely because there were supposed to be no pipes or other underground structures here. Mark and his sons spent the rest of the day uncovering the mysterious object as much as they could. None of them had ever seen anything like it before. The only way Mark could describe it was as a giant, rusted metal bullet. That night, Mark tried to fall asleep, but his thoughts kept returning to the strange metal object. Unable to shake his curiosity, he searched online for clues but found no answers. Determined to investigate further, he began sifting through the old documentation of the house which he had purchased 5 years earlier. He hoped to find information about the previous owner who might shed light on the discovery. After some digging, Mark managed to locate an email address for the previous owner. He quickly sent a message describing what he had found. To his surprise, a reply landed in his inbox within 2 minutes. The speed of the response was startling, but the content of the email was even more shocking. The previous owner pleaded with Mark to leave the object where it was and to bury it again. Under no circumstances was he to tell anyone about it. Mark, stunned by the urgency and secrecy of the message, immediately tried to send a follow-up email for clarification. To his dismay, he discovered that the email address had already blocked him. This meant he could no longer communicate with the man. He even tried to call him, but his number was also blocked. Eventually, Mark was so tired that his eyelids were starting to close more and more. Now his thoughts could not keep him awake any longer, and he hit the sack. The very next morning, Mark decided to call the police and share his find with them. Their first reaction was one of disbelief. Eventually, Mark did manage to convince the officers to send somebody out to his house to come and check out his find. He hoped that the police would come up with a different explanation so that his mind could rest easy again. But soon after the police officer arrived at the house, Mark knew he would not get off easy here. While the officer was fairly clueless at first when he was led into the garden, it did not take long for him to realize what was actually going on here, and it worried him greatly. "You shouldn't have seen this. You shouldn't have seen this." Mark then knew that his dream had been telling the truth. The police officers were wary of Mark, suspecting that he was feigning ignorance about the mysterious object in his backyard. They doubted if he had actually had a conversation with the previous owner, as the email address had gone out of service. This proved not to be good for Mark. Mark was taken aback by this as he found himself unexpectedly being the one apprehended. As he was being taken away, one of the officers began to recite the Miranda rights that Mark had only ever heard in movies. After Mark was taken to the station, he found himself stuck in an interrogation room where across from him a detective sat. The gruff officer kept hammering Mark about where Mark had gotten such an unusual object and why he had stashed it there. Mark tried to tell him about the past owner, but the detective quickly dismissed that. Mark felt hopeless. He needed help, but little did he know that he would get more help than he bargained for. Mark made the decision to halt his own defense and would not utter another word until he had a lawyer present to guide him through this legal minefield. Mark and Patricia's house, once orderly, was now the center stage of an investigation of their own. A whirlwind of documents had scattered along the living room floor. However, they seemed to have hit the jackpot when they came across files that were around 11 years old. Hidden amongst those pages, the family found mention of a permit issued to the previous owner. It authorized him to turn over his yard in order to replace his deteriorating sewage pipes, which had caused a major leak disrupting the property's waste disposal system in the past. Was this the answer they had been looking for? The old homeowner buried it? The documentation indicated that the area of repair coincided with the exact spot where their family had decided to place their new pool and coincidentally found the large metallic object. The puzzle pieces seemed to fall into place, but the largest question remained. Why did the old homeowner feel the need to bury it? Luckily, one of Mark's sons, Toby, was a private investigator. He found, after a lot of digging, information about the former homeowner. Unfortunately, there was a catch, as he hadn't simply moved across town or to a nearby suburb. No, his new home was on the opposite side of the state. Patricia decided to stay home to support her husband, but their two sons, Toby and Brian, had taken it upon themselves to take the 6-hour drive. When Mark's lawyer arrived, he gave Mark a much-needed sense of reassurance. If they failed to prove that he was the one who buried it in his backyard, they would have to release him. The lawyer knew that Patricia and Mark had lived in the house for about 10 years, and he was unsure of the age of the mysterious object. If the investigators could prove that the strange metal object had been underground for a similar duration, Mark would prove to be in big trouble. When Toby and Brian finally arrived at the old owner's house, they found it empty, as no one seemed to be home. They started looking through the windows, which showed a completely furnished and livable home. Maybe they went out. What if this yard was another hiding place for objects such as the ones they had found? At first, looking at the yard seemed futile, but then Toby stumbled upon the shed, and when he opened it, it truly blew his mind. He immediately took out his phone and snapped some pictures of what he had found. He was sure that whatever was in this shed would help prove his father's innocence. Though the shed was nearly filled to the brim with strange objects, the first things they could identify were all different types of metal detectors. Some of them even had some resemblance to the thing they had found in the yard. The boys noted that an assortment of antique firearms were hanging off the wall. As they looked through the shelves, they could also identify shrapnel used by artillery machines. Littered through the shed were components of various explosive devices. They knew that they had to inform the police, but a sudden voice stopped them. "What are you doing on my property? What are you doing on my property?" a female voice said behind the two brothers. Toby and Brian quickly turned around, their hearts pounding in surprise. "Forgive the intrusion, ma'am," Toby began, trying to sound as professional as possible. "I'm Mr. Wilson, a private investigator, and I fear that your husband is involved with a police investigation." She looked shocked as she stumbled back. "My husband?" she stammered. Stepping over the threshold of the home, Toby and Brian were greeted by the sight of an elderly man in an armchair. Toby approached the elderly man. Extending his hand, he introduced himself as private investigator Tobias Wilson, to which John gave his own. Toby asked if he could record the conversation, to which John agreed. It could hopefully prove his father's innocence. "John, the new owner of your previous home has found an object in his backyard, and though it looks to be very old, a permit points to you digging it up or burying it." John exhaled deeply, releasing the weight of years of unspoken secrets. "I had always hoped that the shadows of my past would remain hidden." He gave Toby a look as he said, I know you were in my shed, which means you both now know that I have a fondness for collecting old weaponry. This is something I have been doing for decades, often to Dolores' annoyance. He gives a small laugh. But there was something I had collected, to which even she has no knowledge. About 12 years ago, I came across a tip. There was a deserted area being used for military exercises not all too far from my former residence. However, John said, as the entire perimeter was secured and clearly off limits to civilians, I wouldn't let that stop this. So the next thing I did was illegal. He continued, my greed overwhelmed my better judgment. I simply couldn't resist and I found my way in.